Hi my friends, this is Wayne Yap, and since you've been following me on social media for a while and this video is for social media, I won't go into a long explanation about my history in poker, but I'll let you evaluate my thought processes based on what I say and the quality of my thoughts. So today I'm going to share four very exciting rules of thumb. So you got that, 4 rules of thumbs when it comes to poker to help you really improve your game. When you can make this kind of very somewhat accurate rules of thumb, it will help you in your quest to understand how to play closer to optimal or GTO as some people call it. Again, these are approximations, that's why we call it rules of thumbs, but they will really help you. I am going to try using my note cards again today, so here we go. Number 1, maximum leverage is about 18%. And what do I mean by maximum leverage? So, sorry to jump back for a second. These 4 rules of thumb will be all for pre-flop. So the first rule of thumb is that you want to leverage your stacks to about 18%. When I'm talking about leveraging your stacks, this is talking about effective stack sizes. So a lot of times, when you are able to make a 3-bet or 4-bet to about 18% of stack sizes of effective stacks. So what an effective stack is the shorter of the stacks. So if there are 2 players in a game, I have 20 big blinds and you have 30 big blinds. My 20 big blinds is the effective stack. If there are 3 players in the game or 4 players in the game, then we take all the 3 or 4 players and we look at who has the least number of big blinds. So if the person has the least number of big blinds and that is about 80 big blinds, then we would say that the 80 big blinds is the effective stack. So what it means to 3-bet or 4-bet to 18% is that whenever we have the opportunity to 3-bet to, usually when we try to 3-bet somebody, we 3-bet with the range of sizings is usually between about 2.3x of his raise size to about 4 to 4.5x. So let's say 2.3 to 4.5x. But within this range, we have a lot of options, and choosing our bet sizings, a lot of time it depends on the position we are in. If we are in position to our out of position player, we would choose a slightly smaller sizing because we don't mind giving him some kind of incentive to come in to see the flop. And if you're out of position, it's the kind of the reverse. But I'm getting a little bit out of the topic here. The idea is that within this 2.3 to 4.5x, if we are able to 3-bet or 4-bet or 5-bet, whatever the stack size is at that time, to about 18%, we get to achieve maximum leverage for our stack. The reason for that is that when we make the action and it falls within this 2.3 to 4.5x and it is also at 18%, it doesn't give our opponent a good opportunity to re-bluff us or to have to construct a re-raise range that is not all in. I mean, he could still technically do it, but when he starts re-raising to about, if he wants to re-raise but not go all in, he would have to re-raise to about 30% of the pot, even if he min raises. And that is not a very ideal situation when he has to put 30% of the pot by min raising, and it gives us the opportunity to call very cheaply or to go all in, and when we go all in, it will be hard for him to play his bluffing range because he would have to put 30% of his stack size, effective stack size, or our effective stack size in as a bluff and then be forced to fold. And putting 30% of your money in when you are forced to fold is a pretty bad situation pre-flop. So forcing things to about 18% creates really good leverage, and it reduces one of our opponent's strategic options. And when you understand poker at a pre-flop poker in a deep level, you understand that having more strategic options where our opponents or us can construct value and bluffing range is a very favorable situation. So by going for this 18%, we leverage and reduce one of his strategic options, and therefore it increases the EV of our overall game tree. Alright, so number 2, it's to raise or call button total of what your opponent's raise first in percentage is. So this is a situation when we are just strictly talking about our play on the button. So if we are on the button and somebody has raised first in, there are no other callers before us, or no other callers after the guy raised and it's to us. So this could be, for example, we are on the button and our opponent's on the cutoff. He raises on the cutoff, we are on the button. There are no opponents between us here for sure. But if it's in early position, there are a few players in between. We assume here that they all fold and we are on the button. How we want to construct our range here is that we want to be VPIPing, which means to voluntarily put money in the pot. So we want to call or 3-bet here with approximately an equal range size as our opponent. So if our opponent is playing top 20% of hands in this spot, we can also play about top 20% of hands. Of course, he might be constructing his range a bit differently than us, and we are in position, so we have a bit more incentive to play suited hands because they would realize a lot more equity. We don't need to play so many 2 big cut hands. But the idea is that when he does raise in that spot, we want to, and I mean, if you are playing online and there are holder manager or you have poker tracker or one of those HUDs, you can very easily see how wide he's playing. And I think that you could even play slightly wider than this. You could play slightly wider than your opponent's range, but this is a pretty good rule of thumb to start around your opponent's range. So the example would be that if cutoff is raising 30% of hands and we are on the button, now we want to play about 30% of hands. But within our 30% of hands we want to split between raising and calling. So we 3-bet or call. And you will see later in another rule of thumb that is to 3-bet about 1/3 of what our opponent's raise range is. And then, so if we are 3-betting about 1/3 of that, we 3-bet 10%, then we want to call about 20% of hands. So we usually do this in a polarized fashion, or we do it with a mixed kind of range. And how this changes when you are not on the button is that if you're on the cutoff and the hijack raises to about, let's say he raises 15% of his range and we're on the cutoff, now we think, hey, if I'm on the button, I would play 15% of hands, but I'm on the cutoff and I have more players to act behind me, specifically the button. So what I would do here is I would tighten up a little bit. So every position that you go away from the button, you would just play slightly tighter in terms of how wide you defend or VPIP. So the next is that we will 3-bet 1/3 of our opponent's range. So it's pretty close to the previous point or the previous rule of thumb. Instead of defending equal percentage to what our opponent's range is. So this requires you to understand a lot about, hey, what does top 15% mean? What does top 20%? What does top 30% mean? We have to start being very aware of these things. And this is a more general rule of thumb. It's not specific to the button. It's a relatively aggressive strategy, and if you don't play such an aggressive strategy, you might kind of struggle a bit for a start. But especially if you're playing soft life games or you're playing on hidden sites or apps or just like home games, games that are soft, 3-betting about 1/3 of what we expect our opponent to be playing. If we have a HUD, we can actually see how wide he's playing. If we don't, we can just make assumptions based on our own gut feeling that we are playing against him. And I mean, of course, we try to look at showdowns as well, and we see, for example, if he shows a hand like ace-10 offsuit, then we know that he's playing roughly about 30% of hands, because if he's not playing, or he's playing about, no, ace-10 offsuit is not, okay, if he's playing jack-10 offsuit, and queen-10 offsuit, we know that he's playing like about 20% of hands because it falls in the top 20%. And if it falls out of that category, then we realize that, hey, if it shows up 8-7 offsuit, then we realize that, hey, he's playing pretty loose. He got to have at least 40 to 50% of hands here before he starts playing those hands. So that's how we make our assumptions with how wide our opponent is playing. And when we see our opponent is playing that wide, we just 3-bet him 1/3 as much as the range he uses. So if he's playing 30%, we would 3-bet him 10%. And this can apply to all positions, whether you are on the cutoff or the button or small blind, big blind. The catch is that if there are callers in between, we want to tighten up our range slightly, because if we are still squeezing with this wide of a range, it allows the people in the middle to call and trap us a lot. and we don't want to give people too big of an incentive to trap us that much. So that is the third rule of thumb. And the fourth rule of thumb is when you are polarized, use a 1:1 bluff to value range. So two examples I will give here. The first is cutoff raises. We are on the button. We want to 3-bet him. He raises 30%. We want to 3-bet him with 10%. How we would split our 30% range that we are going to defend here is to 3-bet 10% and call 20%. Then within that 10% of hands that we are 3-betting, we want to have a 1:1 bluff is to value ratio. So what it would look like here roughly, assuming we are playing a purely strictly polarized range, is that we are going to 3-bet the top 5% of hands, so 0 to 5th percentile of hands, we would 3-bet, and then from the 5th to the 25th percentile, we would call, and then we would take the 25th to the 30th percentile to 3-bet again. So that would be our, if you can imagine, it's here is the value, here's the bluff, here's the value, here's the calling, and here are the bluffs. So that's how we would split our range if we are following this 1:1 polarized strategy. On another position would be when we are on the big blind and one player has raised and it's folded around to us. We usually want to use a polarized range here because it is we get a discount when we call. So the middle part of our range we can definitely call, and then we can take the top and the bottom of our range with a 1:1 ratio to play our value to bluff range. This is quite an aggressive strategy, and I highly recommend for you to try that. It would be really win rate changing, especially if you start using solvers and using simulators to understand how to play post flop after you have this kind of polarized range. It is quite fun to play big pots when you have a polarized range because it allows you to polarize a lot on later streets. But that's the end of my 4 rules of thumbs. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time.